It's the boy Mars and Barrage. I'm back. What we're about to do right now is continue, of course, the expansion and understanding of our identity as Aboriginal people. But we're going to just read into some books and look online and look into some different historical events to understand that, we've been named multiple things. We've been named Moors, we've been named Jews, we've been named Saracens, and we've been named Indians. So when you read in certain books, you may read that the Saracens did this, the Jews went here, the Indians went to war in this year, the Saracens lived here. All these different names and terms and titles are talking about the same people. All right. So we're going to read a book that I found online. It's just some pretty interesting stuff. It's called The Unconverted Self, Jews, Indians, and the Identity of Christian Europe by Jonathan Boyanin. And I'll repeat the title one more time. It's called The Unconverted Self, Jews, Indians, and the Identity of Christian Europe by Jonathan Boyanin. And what we're going to do in this right now is just read about some of the differences between the new rising Catholic Church, the serf class that was now, getting into their own identity, because that was really the problem that a lot of these albino, Europeans were having, just a sense of identity, wanting to come into humanity and wanting to civilize themselves. And one way that you would do it is you would create a culture around your people. And Christianity is, just the culture that naturally was created for them. So while they were getting their identity together, they wanted to, ethnic cleanse certain areas because they had a lot of people around them that didn't look like them and were practicing a much more ancient form of what they were practicing at these modern, times. So before I just talk too much, let's just go into this reading. We're going to read, and then also we'll talk about Jerusalem being invaded, because it's no coincidence that you have a Jerusalem in Georgia, and it's more on the southeastern part of Georgia. I don't know if it's right along the coast, but nevertheless, there is a Jerusalem, Georgia, and also an Egypt, Georgia. And when we look into the American Revolutionary War as it pertains to Georgia, a lot of the wars were going along the coast. Okay, we were fighting the Spaniards, and the English, and different Europeans who were coming here. But nevertheless, the American Revolutionary War is also in their history books known as the Holy Crusades in some angles, and you'll see why I say that when I read in a minute. So we'll get an understanding of Jerusalem being sacked by this new form of Christianity, not the old Gnostic, Coptic, Orthodox, original indigenous form of Christendom that our people created. Not more so that, but this more pale skinned, blue-eyed form of Christianity that we know would later day end up ruling and colonizing the entire planet. So we're just gonna get a history of that and help this seal the deal more with our confidence and security with our own identities. So before I read this, I'm going to say it one more time. In the history books, us, the indigenous Americans, Aboriginal people, they have called us Jews, Moslems, Indians, and Saracens. So these four terms, Jews, Moslems, Indians, and Saracens, they all talking about you now, so-called black people. So so-called black people these are four identities in the history books that they have labeled you as: Indians, Jews, Saracens, and Muslims. So let's read about this stuff a little bit and how we were conflicting with the different amalgamated and pale new editions of Christianity or Christendom. Once again, this is coming from The Unconverted Self, Jews, Indians, and the Identity of Christian Europe by Jonathan Boyanin. Focusing on Muslim differences raises the specter of the long list of non-Christian identities in the face of which Western Christendom continued to redefine itself. A list suggested, for example, by Raymond Lull's proposal long before Columbus's voyage in his 1305 Liber Define, that the Pope established 4 monasteries specialized in the education of missionaries. 1 monastery for the missionary to the Saracens, 1 for the missionaries to the Jews, 1 for those to the Schematics, 1 for those to the Tartars and other pagans. A review of various lists of the church's enemies by one Adamar of Cabanes, suggests that in his time and place, Jews rather than Saracens tended to be listed first. So let's go over this real quick. Now, as I said, these 4 terms are all talking about the same people, but all our people had different forms and different heritages and different, ways of life, what we call culture. So different cultures. Just like today, indigenous people from, let's say, California got a way that they do things. Indigenous people from, let's say, New York got a way that they do things. Indigenous people from, here in Atlantis or Atlanta, we got a way we do things. So we all indigenous people, but we all got our own forms of low culture. Down here in the South and down here, once again, the dirty South, as they say, or the deep South, the brothers are riding the 95, the early 90s, mid 90s, Impalas, all black, tinted out. Over in the West Coast, the brothers may ride in the Impalas, but more so with the hydraulic system and all that. And then you got the brothers up in the Northeast, they may ride in, a lot of them brothers, don't be really, they be walking and stuff from New York, but, I don't know, they may have certain kind of little whips they have, but nevertheless, it's just all representing certain cultures, but they still all indigenous people. So when they saying Jews, they just mean indigenous people who have this certain type of culture. When they say Muslims, they mean indigenous people with these certain type of cultures, etc. All right. But also keep in mind too that when we say Islam and when we saying Judaism, these are really brother and sister or sibling faith systems. All right. Now you will see sometimes they will refer to the Muslims or people that deal with Islam as Saracens. Now we know in the mythos, in the story, that Abraham and Sarah had Isaac. Isaac had Jacob, and Jacob's name was changed to Israel. Israel had 12 tribes, and one of these tribes was Judah. Okay, so when they saying Jews, they really, they talking about Judah, because remember they all had different mothers. So some of them even looked a little different. All right. So when we talking about the Israelites, a lot of us are primarily talking about Judah, because, as far as a lot of things I've seen, that's what they were referred to as with us. Now, some of these other tribes, they could have been, they were indigenous people too, but nevertheless, they just all had different mothers. So when they saying Saracens, don't get confused and just think, oh, Muslims or Moors. You got to remember that these are some people of Judah too. Okay, because once again, their mother was, or their grandmother rather, would have been Sarah. Now, Abraham and Hagar had Ishmael. Okay, and you will see in certain books that they will say that Ishmael or the Ishmaelites are the Moors. And they're not wrong, because Hagar, once again, she was from that same region, Egypt. Matter of fact, when Abraham and Sarah were in Egypt is when he met Hagar. So even Ishmael is nevertheless an indigenous person that would have looked just like us. So what I'm saying is that Abraham, Hagar, and Ishmael, and Sarah, and Isaac, these people all look the same. Like today, we would call these people so-called black folks. All right. So don't get confused by that term Saracens, because some of these Saracens, they deal with Islam, but they also are Israelites too. All right. So let's keep going. Also, too, is saying that at this time that the Catholic Church primary enemy is Jews. Okay. So they saying that the Catholic Church right now, this amalgamated or pale new Christendom, that its key enemy right now are the Jews. or at least this is something that was quoted by Raymond Lull in his book Liber Defined in 1305. So let's move on. Okay. Just trying to get us to the right part. Here we go, right here. All right. Jews, along with pagans and heretics, were at any rate one of the categories among or alongside which Christian writers tried to fit Muslims. Many of the same tropes and accusations leveled against Jews were also leveled against Muslims. One was the charge of Muslim carnality, not only in the polemics against Muslim marriage practices and the idea of continued sexuality in heaven, but as a critique of their rationality, as in Thomas Aquinas's reason for the faiths against Muslims. Quote, since the Muslims are carnal, they can think only of what is flesh and blood, end quote. This was related to the view, increasingly prevalent by the 13th century and beyond, of Muslims as, quote, irrational, similar to accusations that Jews indulged in contemptuous sacrilege. Muslims were portrayed in chronicles of the First Crusade as mocking the Passion of Christ. Back in England, Jews were portrayed in medieval mystery plays as followers of Mound, while the late 13th century Hereford map depicted them as worshiping an idol labeled Mahum, another variant of Muhammad's name in medieval Christendom. Interesting. And in 16th century Spain, laws of pure blood originally designed to exclude new Christians of Jewish ancestry were also applied against Moriscos, new Christians of Muslim ancestry. So let's go through this real quick. So first it's saying that the Jews were fit in the same category as the Muslims, according to a lot of Christian writers. Then it's saying that many of the accusations leveled against Jews were also leveled against Muslims. These new Christians are saying that the Muslims are carnal because of their marriage practices and continued sexuality in heaven. Because once again, you know, the indigenous people, the men had multiple women. And then it says that the Jews were seen by the Christians as mocking the Passion of Christ. And then it goes on to say that in England, Jews were portrayed in certain plays as followers of Mound. And in the 13th century map, it depicted Jews as worshiping an idol labeled Mahum, which was another variant of the name Muhammad in medieval Christendom. Then it goes on to say finally that in 16th century Spain, or the 1500s, after the Inquisition and the expulsion of the Moors and Jews, that new Christians of Jewish ancestry were excluded, which were Moriscos, and these were new Christians of Muslim ancestry. So as we can see right here, that the Jews and the Muslims ultimately are being treated the same because they are the same people. Okay. They got cultures that, you know, are somewhat similar. All right. Not somewhat similar, but they're similar, you know, Arabic and Hebrew. And then the people look the same too. So in ancient Jerusalem, or in old Jerusalem, the Muslims and the Jews, or the Indians, or the Saracens, they all look the same. Okay. and they were all dealing with Islam, which ultimately is universal peace. All right. And they both were worshiping the Most High. So it's just, but this part right here is interesting, where it says that in England, Jews were portrayed in plays as worshiping an idol labeled Mahum, which was another name of Muhammad. So why would Jews be worshiping Muhammad? Okay. Could Muhammad be another version of, let's just say, a predecessor? Because these are really archetypes, like how Abraham is an archetype. So these Jews could have just been paying homage to their forefather. All right. They saying Muhammad or Baphomet, but this could be Abraham. Okay. Because Abraham or Abba means father. Okay. Or Ab rather. Because like in Hebrew, you have Aleph. Okay. And that has to do with father principle. So once again, whether they calling you a Morisco, a Moor, an Indian, a Saracen, or a Jew, they're talking about indigenous people. And this is right here, even in America. So I'm not talking about over in the Middle East. I'm talking about right here in America, because there is a Jerusalem in Georgia. So how do you know what Jerusalem they're talking about? They had a lot of different Holy Crusades. All right. They had Holy Crusades in the ancient world, and they had them in the more modern world. What we know of as like the 1100s and the 1200s, the 1400s, the 1300s. But they had Holy Crusades before then. Okay. So which Jerusalem are they talking about? Is what I'm asking you. Indeed, the poetics of projected Indian, Muslim, and Jewish identities were remarkably susceptible to mutual substitution. Excuse me. So let me read that. Indeed, the poetics of projected Indian, Muslim, and Jewish identities were remarkably susceptible to mutual substitution. So it's saying that Indian, Muslim, and Jewish identities could be substituted for one another. So you could be talking or looking at one so-called black person, and they could be identified as a Muslim, a Jew, or an Indian. This is ultimately what it's saying, y'all. Depending on the alliances and divisions that one is led to promote prospectively or perceptive retrospectively, various substitutions and elisions can be made, and over the centuries, most of them have been made. How do you say this? Idio, IUDIO, for Indio. So you know how you say Indio or Indus, like Indio, and vice versa, or more for Jew. So let me say that again. So Idio for Indio, or more for Jew. Any temptation to read one of these three terms as the fundamental figure of difference against which the others takes the ultimate historical meaning. Jews, because the persistent Christian habit of identifying both with and against Israel. Indians and other colonized peoples, because the encounter with them defines modernity. Muslims, because their comprehensive ideological and temporal competition forces Christian Europe into a consciousness of itself, must founder on this welter of multi-directional associations. As in the Cantigo di Santa Maria, quoted as an epigraph to this chapter, Jews could be designated as an enemy hated by the Virgin, quote, worse than the Moors. Yet earlier, Bernard of Clairvaux reminded Crusaders that while it is good that you go against the Ishmaelites, whosoever touches a Jew to take his life is like one who harms Jesus himself. A chronicler of the Fourth Crusade similarly reported several leading clerics' opinion that the Saracens were worse than the Jews. Pope Alexander II praised bishops in Spain who were protecting Jews from those who advanced against Saracens, drawing a distinction. Fuck, where I was at? Oh, here I am. Yeah, drawing a clear distinction between the justified continued existence of the former and the need to fight the latter. So let's go through that real quick before I keep reading. So first it's saying that Indio, Moor, and Jew, these three terms as the fundamental figure of difference against which the others take the ultimate historical meaning. So what it's saying that these different terms are identifying the same person, but from a different historical context. So if I'm looking at a so-called black person and I'm calling them a Jew, this is because this is probably an aboriginal or a person who was persistent because of the persistent Christian habit of identifying both with and against Israel. So it's showing, you know, the people who are the original Israelites. The people that they call Indians are those that they colonize. Check that out. So the term Indian or Indio, as far as the Christian, the Western Christian pale Catholic, the new people, when they use that term Indian, that's just describing anybody that they've colonized. So that means even Moors and Jews can be Indians because they colonized them. When they kicked them out of Southern Europe and when they came and colonized here in the Americas, they were colonizing Indians. So the Holy Crusades was about fighting Indians. And then it says that the Virgin of the Catholic Church hates Jews more than Moors. Ain't that something? So let's keep going. It says, as we might expect in a discussion of actual military conflict rather than mere daggers of the faith, Victoria bolstered his argument by drawing a contrast between the Indians and the Moors, who, rather than the Jews this time, were said to have rejected the gospel message. The association between the Indians and the Moors was readily available, and not only because there were Spanish soldiers in Mexico who had fought the latter before fighting overseas. Indians could and apparently readily did come to portray and actively occupy the role of Moslems in the kind of Moros and Christians pageants that had been mounted in Catholic Iberia for centuries. So what this is saying, that the association between the Indians and Moors was readily available because the Spanish soldiers in Mexico had fought the Moors before fighting the Indians. Now, just like they say in the Marines, from the shores of Tripoli to the halls of Montezuma. From the shores of Tripoli, those were the Moors in North Africa. The shores of Montezuma, those are the Indians of the Americas. So if the Spanish Amalgamated Church fought the Moors of North Africa or Southern Europe and the Indians of the Americas, and they're identifying them as the same people, what is this telling you? It just means that when they identify one as a Moor and when they identify one as an Indian, it's probably from more of a historical context or a particular perspective. Let's continue. Then it says that the Moors and the Indians were said to reject the gospel message. So they were rejecting that whole Jesus stuff and all that. The Indians and the Moors, they weren't going for it. And the Jews weren't either. So let's keep going. The association between the Indians and Moors were readily available, and not only because there were Spanish soldiers in Mexico who had fought the latter before fighting overseas. The Friar Montolinea's History of the Indians of New Spain contains a detailed account of what must have been an impressive and lengthy historical pageant of the conquest of Jerusalem in 1539. Wait a minute. So why are they writing in the History of the Indians of New Spain contains a detailed account of what must have been the historical pageant of the conquest of Jerusalem in 1539. So in 1539, if the Spanish were invading in the Americas, why are they calling it the conquest of Jerusalem? Let me repeat that. The Friars Montolinea's History of the Indians of New Spain contains a detailed account of what must have been an impressive and lengthy historical pageant of the conquest of Jerusalem in 1539. All the parts were played by the Indians, though it is a bit difficult to keep that in mind as we try to follow the almost dazzling list of identities they portrayed and the costumes that they wore. So they saying in this book, History of the Indians of Spain, it contains accounts of the conquest of Jerusalem in 1539 and all the roles of the people of Judah or the Israelites were played by the Indians. So they saying that when the Spanish invaded the Americas in the early 1500s, this was the conquest of Jerusalem. This was the Holy Crusades. This was the Muslims fighting the Christians, because the Indians are who they are identifying as the Muslims or the Jews. So when the Catholic Church and the Spaniards, the amalgamated ones, invaded the Americas, they were invading Israel. They were invading the children of Judah. Okay, let's see. So just to wrap that point up, now you know when we say the Holy Crusades was in the Americas, and when we say that the conquest of Jerusalem was in the Americas, we have a historical account right here that we can deal with. Now I'll read it one more time. That the Friar Montolinea's History of the Indians of New Spain contains a detailed account of what must have been an impressive and lengthy historical pageant of the conquest of Jerusalem in 1539. All the parts were played by Indians. So weren't the Spanish invading the Americas in the early 1500s? They were invading Jerusalem, people. And the Indians are the Israelites, or the Saracens, or the Jews, or the Moors. They're all the same people. The Aztecs, the Mayans. These are the people that they're talking about. So the Aztecs are the Jews, the Muslims, the Saracens. That's who they are. The Inca, they are the Jews, the Muslims, the Saracens, the Indians. So-called black people right here in the Americas. Okay. Right here in the Americas. So that's coming out of the book, The Unconverted Self, Jews, Indians, and the Identity of Christian Europe. If you want to, check that on your own. So now we're going to read about the siege of Jerusalem in 70 so-called AD. All right. This is just coming off of Wikipedia because I just want to get the basis so we can go into it. The siege of Jerusalem in the year 70 AD. Now, first, before I keep reading, remember, like I just said now, the Holy Crusades and the siege of Jerusalem, or the Crusades or the conquest of Jerusalem, it happened more than one time. You're going to look in the books, it's going to say 66 AD sometimes, or CE sometimes, excuse me. You're going to see, once again, 1539, early 1500s. You're going to see a lot of different years of the Holy Crusades because it was a lot of different phases of it. You had Jews fighting Christians, Muslims fighting Jews, Muslims fighting, everybody was just kind of fighting each other and stuff. But ultimately, it ended up being the Catholic Church against the Muslims and the Jews, ultimately. And a lot of these Muslims and Jews had to convert into Christianity by force. And a lot of them chose to go underground because when Jerusalem was sacked here in the Americas, a lot of our ancestors actually, fled. everybody didn't get killed, and they hid a lot of the jewels and treasures that they had in the temples of Jerusalem. So that was here in the Americas and over in Europa or Asia Minor. So when Jerusalem was sacked, you had ancestors that left, and they came to create a lot of the families in what we know of as the Holy Roman Empire or the Moorish Holy Roman Empire. So a lot of those old European families, like these different European dynastic bloodline last names that we have, these surnames we have, a lot of them go back to those different families that actually fled Jerusalem. Okay, here in the Americas and over in Asia Minor. All right. So once again, now that ties us to the Holy Roman Empire, or what they say the Moorish Holy Roman Empire, the old one, not the recent new one, the amalgamated, bleached out one when the Catholic Church and the Spaniards came. You know, those amalgamated people and those pale, blue-eyed people, and then some of the dirty-ass Negroes that was with them. I'm not talking about that Holy Roman Empire. I'm talking about the ancient one that they stole that one from. All right, we have a bloodline tied to those people. All right, because during the sack of Jerusalem, not everybody was killed. Some of the ancestors left. All right, that's how we still got the Zohar. That's why we still got the Kabbalah. That's why we still have the different mystery systems of Judaism. Okay, the mysticisms of Judaism. In the modern world, y'all call these people the Rothschilds and these different Jewish wealthy families. Okay, that's ruling the planet. A lot of these are bleached out families that was once our people. All right. So we're gonna read about the siege of Jerusalem, but I'm not gonna say a year because it happened in different years. So you got 66 CE, 70 CE, and of course 1539, early 1500s. Okay. The siege of Jerusalem was the decisive event of the Jewish-Roman War. The Roman army led by the Emperor Titus, with Tiberius Julius Alexander as his second in command, besieged and conquered the city of Jerusalem, which had been controlled by Judean rebel factions since 66 CE, following the Jerusalem riots of 66, when the Judean free government was formed in Jerusalem. So like I said, you know, the children of Judah, when you say Israel, you're just talking about all of Jacob's, you know, children and everybody who came after his children. But when you're saying Judah, you're talking about Jacob and that woman he had children with in that lineage. All right. And these were the people that was ruling Jerusalem. That was us. And, you know, some of our ancestors got the fuck up out of there when that shit got hot, you know, and they went underground and stuff. So a lot of these, you know, once again, these Holy Roman Empire families are really black, what they call the black nobility. These are our folks, and a lot of them are so-called Jewish, okay, and Muslims. They both deal with Islam, all right, and they're the ones that created what's known as the Knights of Malta, the Knights of Pythias, and all those original knights, the Knights Templars. You know, they the ones that created all that stuff and financed that stuff, all right. So it's the boy Blackbeard. Just want to drop some history. I hope y'all learn a little bit from it. Stay tuned. I'm out.